原住民的相关研究，而且致力于协助我们原住民部落的一些部落培力所以我们邀请他也来指导我们部落培力以及资源管理。他卓越的研究和社会贡献，让他在2023年获颁澳洲国家最高的荣誉是 The Order of Australia， 也曾于2017年获颁地理学者的就国际地理学会的这个澳洲国际奖章 Australia International Medal Institute of Australian Geographers。2017年他也获颁McDonald Homer's Medal 地理学教育的荣誉奖。2008年他也获很多的正义和和平相关奖项，而且他是非常多的期刊的这个审查者，以及呢有很多卓越的这个学术研究所以我们很荣幸能够邀请到Howitt教授到我们台湾来所以不只是台师大的邀请，他是教育部的玉山学者，所以我们也把他的讲座呢公告给各地大家都可以来参与。那么他对于原住民权利有深入的研究，也采用参与式的社会影响评估方式来进行原住民族自然资源管理上有关法律和财产系统和权益的分析因此对于原住民的组织、非营利团体政府部门、产业界和专家学者的协同，他都有专门的研究。那这一次他应邀来台，那同时他也也是呢。在他的社区在澳洲的原住民社区，他也有相关的一个计划正在进行。所以呢，我们也在台湾有机会跟Howitt教授学习，我们也会带他到部落，以及呢我们在原住民族教育方面希望有他的指导。而且他可以来3年，这3年当中，我们希望我们能为我们台湾的原住民教育和这个相关的部落的协力和培力呢，能够有一些好的发展。好，那今天呢，除了Howitt教授的演讲之外呢，我们也特别邀请这个我们原住民台师大原住民研究与发展中心的主任汪明辉教授来参与我们的这个，等一下有时间的话就语谈。那整个课程的这个进行当中在英语的解说或者最后的 summary 呢，我们特别邀请刚从英国 Sussex 怎么念 Sussex 的 University。塞克斯大学毕业的读博士、微语博士他是做发展地理学就发展学 （development study） 在这个从英国刚毕业的博士，那这一天他也在协助我们这个计划，所以我们相信这样的组合呢，能让我们对于发展还有部落的培力和这个原住民知识体系和教育，能够有很好的一个共同的一个发展。那今天在开始，我们希望往后的3年，大家都共同来参与。全台湾人都可以邀请Howitt教授前往的讲学。好 ，Let's welcome Professor Howitt again. Let's start our
It's always nervous when you hear someone talking about you in another language. You hear all these things that you think, oh, I think I know what's being said, but one's never sure. Thank you all for turning up. I feel I need to apologise for not being able to speak to you in any Indigenous language or any other language than the colonising English. Is that better? Excellent. So, let me thank you for the welcome. Let me start with some questions. Because this is a lecture in a course, I want to first of all address the students in the course on Indigenous community conservation. And I want to ask you to think about some questions that we will come back to in the course. And I want to think about them because my starting point is usually to ask you what you think you know, why you think you know it, and to challenge you to begin to think about what you don't know and why you don't know it. Because many things that we don't know are either hidden or taken from us by colonisation. So I try to think outside the frames of colonial thinking and try and bring that to the work we do. So the first question is, who do you think are the experts in Indigenous community conservation? And normally in a class, I would ask you to answer that question off the top of your head. So we're in a class. Who do you think are the experts?
I think that the local people.
Thank you, Professor Leo. This is why Professor Leo is a professor. And I know not everybody in this room is a geographer. And in the world of academia, we don't need everybody to be a geographer. But I'm a geographer. I'm a very passionate geographer. But I'd like you to think about what geographers bring to the conversation about Indigenous community conservation. And I'm going to try and unpack each of those words in the coming weeks. I won't ask you to answer that because welcome.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry. You can be sorry at the end that you came. Don't be sorry at the beginning. And the third question I want to ask is, how do we know what we know? Yeah, and so I want to start from a very philosophical way of thinking about knowledge and thinking about what becomes knowledge and what isn't understood as knowledge. So, in the end, I know that Professor Tsai has introduced me as a teacher with all these awards, but as teachers we are only ever as good as we are as learners. And as soon as we stop learning, we stop being good teachers. So, I'm always interested in how do we learn about these issues, and how do you think you're going to learn, and what do we need to know, and how can we begin to know it? How can we really be confident that we know things? Not because we've learned it out of a book, but because we understand what's important and what really matters. So, I will come back to those questions in this course, and some of you who are here for just a short time might get the answers. But life is not full of answers, life is often full of questions. So, maybe you've said all this, Professor Tsai, what I was going to say about who I am. I'm a retired geographer. I worked at Macquarie University. I have worked about social and environmental justice across multiple scales, from the very local to the very global. And I've tried to pull together social, environmental and economic justice, so thinking about those different domains in particular places. That's why I'm a geographer. I think about place and the relationality of places. I've worked with mostly Australian First Nations. I currently work with the traditional owners, the custodians of Sydney. So the Aboriginal people who experienced the first onslaught of colonisation. And that gives me a particular perspective on colonial experience. I was born on their country, I grew up on their country, and I have been called back to work with those people. I will talk about that from time to time as well. But I've done a lot of work in different places. I've worked as a teacher. I started my professional life not just as a researcher, but as a teacher in elementary schools, trying to work out how do you bring young people, K to 6, into knowing the world. So I've taught people to read, I've taught people to write, and I've spent the rest of my life in universities trying to teach people how to think. Nina is looking at me with quizzical eyes because she's my PhD graduate who might know something about what I mean. So I continue to be a learner, not just a teacher. So you will have things to teach me, as well as perhaps I will have things to teach you. Okay, that's probably enough about me. Let's get into it. I want to start at the very big scale. So I've started by saying we'll talk about the United Nations and the global scale. But I don't just want to talk about the United Nations. But I want to start at the planetary scale and come down to the very local scales of particular and diverse Indigenous people's cultures, their governances, and their identities. So we know, I hope we know, that global scale planetary systems, whether we're talking about physical systems, biological systems, economic, political or social systems, we know that when they work together, they're always more than the sum of their parts. So clever people at universities will analyse particular bits. The political scientists will look at the politics. The geographers will look at landscapes and societies. The sociologists will look at particular social processes. But when we think about those systems, they're more than those fragments. They mean more, they do more than just putting together the fragments. But 21st century thinking often thinks that the global scale drives things from the top. Yeah? We get what's known as top-down thinking, that the most important things happen at the top of that scale hierarchy. And that filters down. So in nation states, it's the national government that decides and drives things. I want to turn that on its head. Yeah? I want to say that it's not that big is better. It's not that the planet is where everything happens. We need to put things into a context. We need to understand, we need to build up our understanding and our relationships. And ultimately, I'm going to argue, we need to be connected somewhere. Yeah? That the global system isn't this thing that sits above us. It's actually built from connections, what in Australia we would call connections to country, connections to place. And that part of our problem as a global system is that we have many institutions, many political, economic, social processes that think they're not connected to place. So they undermine the conservation of environmental capital, of cultural knowledge, of social capital. They drive towards wealth as money rather than wealth as connection and understanding. So, when we talk about Indigenous rights in the global context, we need to understand that there are tensions between the global and the local scale. Nothing is easy. So one of the tensions that I want to try and tease apart to understand is the tension between individual rights, rights that belong to people as individual persons, and collective rights, rights that belong to peoples as groups of people. And much of the Indigenous rights discourse is about rights that belong to collectives. So that's the first thing. Human rights belong to people as individuals. Indigenous rights belong to people as groups. The other thing I want to start from the very beginning is to say we need to understand that the United Nations is an institution made up of nation states. And from my way of looking at the world, nation states are part of the problem. Yeah? That nation states and their advocacy of their own rights as nation states, often as colonial, or what get called settler colonial states, are part of the problem. So, when we get to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we need to understand it is a declaration about Indigenous peoples by an institution made up of nation states. So, I'll go to the last stop point here. At best, it's a benchmark of minimum rights. Yeah? It's not the answer. So don't go looking for an answer to Indigenous people's experience of trauma and loss of rights in the UNDRIP. The declaration is the minimum standard that nation states have agreed to accept. It took more than 30 years to negotiate. So you need to understand it wasn't easily conceded by the nation states. Chippewa Professor of Law at University of California, Los Angeles, Dwayne Champagne, said many arguments by Indigenous people and their non-governmental organisations were set against the arguments by the nation states. And of course, 4 key settler colonial states, Australia, New Zealand, United States of America and Canada, chose to oppose acceptance of the declaration when it was voted on in 2007. They've subsequently changed their minds, but that doesn't mean they've implemented the rights embodied in the declaration. Why was it needed? Why was the declaration needed? It was needed because even the basic human rights that are supposed to be guaranteed by the United Nations weren't available to Indigenous peoples across the world. Of course, what we know every day is that those basic human rights that are supposed to be guaranteed by the United Nations are not available to lots of people. Not just Indigenous peoples, but to lots of individuals, to lots of groups of people, to groups of people who aren't represented by nation states. But in the case of Indigenous peoples, there are particular issues that are common to the experience of colonised Indigenous groups. So I'm going to start by saying the declaration is just the beginning. It doesn't recognise Indigenous peoples as equal to nation states, and the rights that are listed in the declaration depend on their being legislated by nation states, and most nation states have not provided adequate legislation to
protect those rights. So, having said all that, it's an important document, and it provides some critically important benchmarks that are relevant to Indigenous community conservation. It consists of 42 articles that specify rights that apply to Indigenous peoples. In Article 1 confirms that Indigenous people are entitled to all the rights that are listed as human rights, as civil, cultural, social, political rights that are recognised by the United Nations. But in addition, Indigenous peoples, as groups of people, have a right to self-determination, which is Article 3, to self-government, which is Article 4, and to distinct Indigenous institutions, which is Article 5 of the Declaration. They've got a right to practice their cultures, religions, languages and traditions, to have free, prior, informed consent established about key decisions affecting them. They have rights to their own territories and resources, to their heritage and knowledges. They have a right to good health. They've got a right to be free from forced relocation, from military occupation, from discrimination and the loss of their identities. And they've got a right to maintain rights that have been previously negotiated in other treaties. So the treaties that have been established during colonial eras and which have often been ignored by the colonial states. So the rights, Article 43 says the rights recognised in the Declaration constitute the minimum standards for survival, dignity and well-being. The minimum standards. So it's quite just a starting point. And yet it's too much for many nation states to acknowledge and to implement. And Article 29, we'll come back to that at various points in the course, but that's the crucial article in relation to the course topic of Indigenous community conservation. It says that Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and its productive capacity. The state shall establish and implement assistance programs for Indigenous peoples for such conservation and protection without discrimination. States shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place on the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior and informed consent. And states shall also take effective measures to ensure, as needed, that programs for monitoring, maintaining and restoring the health of Indigenous peoples is developed and peoples affected by such materials are duly implemented. And they say that without any sense of irony. So, collective rights belong to peoples, not to states. But we live in a global system that is shaped by the institutions, structures and practices of colonialism. The nation states speak strongly of their own right to self-determination, but they see Indigenous people's rights to self-determination as a threat to their own territorial integrity. So that's a tension to start with. We've seen the 4 dissident nation states, Australia, Canada, USA and New Zealand, all have arguments that any right to self-determination threatens the territorial integrity or the social integrity of the nation state. The nation states treat their right to self-defence as a reason to limit Indigenous people's rights to self-determination and self-government. And nation states often enact laws that actually criminalise Indigenous people's everyday activities. So that, if I take the Australian example, we have a very high rate of Indigenous involvement in the criminal justice system. Not because Indigenous people are criminals, but because their everyday behaviour is criminalised. So things like hunting, fishing, movement, their practices of religion, their exercise of culture, in many places using their languages, those things are all become criminal activities that bring people into conflict with the state. And of course, settler colonial states have a lot of different shapes. They work differently. There isn't just one model of being a nation state, any more than there is just one model for being an Indigenous people. But ideas of the nation, the people, the public that are created by nation states are often created in ways that exclude Indigenous peoples as full citizens, as having full rights as citizens or as members of the national interest, the national public. So we end up with thinking of us versus them, the coloniser versus the colonial. In English, I'm forever trying to get people to think about little words like the word us. Little word that has such an impact on how people relate to each other, how people are able to relate to each other. Who are we? Who are they? And what makes us different to them? What makes them different to us? In ways that become divisive rather than inclusive. So, I think if I go back to my title, it was the United Nations Declaration, Colonial Geographies and Indigenous Knowledges. So let me now jump into colonial knowledges and colonial geographies. These are geographies of possession and of power. Yeah? The colonial settler states want to possess, want to own, control, exercise power. Aileen Morton Robertson, going woman of the Quandamooka tribe in Minjerribah in Australia, talks about a fantastic book called The White Possessive, about how the colonial male gaze wants to possess whatever it sees. Now, from my experience, one of the reasons that I'm in Taiwan is that when I arrived in Taiwan in 2007, I was astounded by my own ignorance. Yeah? I became a very early learner because I knew very little. My model of colonialism was about European occupation of the world. What I learnt in my very first trip to Taiwan is that this was a place to unsettle my own understanding of colonialism and to recognise different sorts of colonial experience. I'll probably talk about that. I'll tell lots of stories, and what's on the slides won't always matter. I will try to be disciplined. But that use of the term white in so much of the colonial and post-colonial studies literature. When you look at it from a Taiwanese perspective, a Taiwanese vantage point, it's too Eurocentric. It sort of tells a story which is far too simple. Taiwan's story is much more nuanced and complicated that I think has much to teach the world. So that's why I'm back so often, because I'm here as a learner. Yeah? So, understanding that trying to think of Taiwan as a prize to be possessed is not a very good way of looking after Taiwan, yeah? Of doing the conservation work that needs to be done on this beautiful island or these beautiful islands, this archipelago. But what we know is that the colonising societies continue to want to fight about possessing and controlling. So Benedict Anderson, in a fantastic book that will seem very old to many of you, from 1983, but some old people thought really good stuff. That's why we go back to the old philosophers sometimes. You know? Not everything new is necessarily the best stuff. And I don't say that just because I'm getting older. But he talked about the colonial nation states as imagined communities. Yeah? That the colonial nation states imagine the world in particular ways, imagine themselves in particular ways. But the way they exercise power brings those imaginaries into reality through the exercise of power. By the control of wealth, resources, the control of places, the control of people, through armed occupation, slavery, violence and theft. Now the social movements addressing decolonisation and anti-colonial and anti-racist movements have challenged, and they continue to challenge, many of those elements of colonial geographies. So there are lots of ways to work against the colonising framework. And in the conditions of a global climate and environmental emergency, we need to push aside that thinking about possession and power. We will not solve, we will not meet the challenges we face as a species, as part of planetary systems of human and non-human entities. Will not meet those challenges by thinking possessing and exercising power is the way forward. So we come to Indigenous geographies as a window on ways forward. So I've come from the global down to particular people's relations with particular places. I use the word geographies with a small g, not geography with a big G, the discipline geography. I talk about Indigenous geographies as the places that people belong to, the places that people care about, the places that contain our relations. Not just our family, but our kin, our relations in other species, in landscapes, in places. So the geographies in which Indigenous people's lives, cultures, languages, our pasts and futures are played out. So more generally, I think of Indigenous geographies being about belonging rather than possessing. about caring rather than exercising power. So I want to turn those two ideas of possessing and power on their heads and start instead, I think, about belonging and caring as how we start thinking about our responsibilities as human beings. So geographies of care is a bit of a catchphrase in some places at the moment. Provide us a way of thinking about our responsibilities as humans to each other and to the places that look after us. A way of thinking about justice and sustainability through care rather than through the exercise of power. If we start thinking about ideas of becoming and belonging instead of being and having, then we can change how we think about power and change how we think about our rights and responsibilities as citizens. Indigenous community strategies about conservation are often precisely about expanding the geographies of care to encompass caring for each other, caring for environment, caring for the past as the foundation for caring for the future. So let me finish with some key ideas. That Indigenous knowledges are a foundation for what I think of as learning to belong together in places with others. Yeah? Not a foundation for owning, possessing, having, just being, but belonging together. So, if I point to this word, to the word knowledges, in Chinese, is knowledges usually got the English equivalent of an S? Is it a plural? Because in English, I've taught my computer to not do this, but in Mr. Gates, the founder of Microsoft Word, always puts a red wiggly line under knowledges if you use it, because there's supposed to be only one knowledge, and that's the knowledge that the colonizer says is knowledge. Yeah? So just right at that very foundational level of being able to say, actually there's more than one way of looking at the world. There's more than one way of knowing the world. That there are multiple Indigenous knowledges. And those are knowledges of familiarity and connection. They're not knowledge. Universities specialise in knowledges of abstraction, of theory. These are knowledges of familiarity and connection to places over time. They are based on multiple observations and practices that work over time. Most importantly, they're also knowledges of belonging and care. Yeah? They're not knowledges that can be mobilised just because you know it. So I'm doing myself out of a job here. I'm saying university professors' knowledge that isn't knowledge of connection and belonging needs to be asked to be responsible to connection and belonging, to caring, not just knowing. Indigenous peoples' movements have been constrained by not just past historical colonisation, but by the ongoing everyday trauma of continuing colonisation. In working with my Durham colleagues in Sydney, I see how the everyday practices of environmental planning, of business as usual, causes trauma, deep and abiding trauma. And that trauma is constructed across local, national, global scales every day. The other thing we need to strongly recognise that Indigenous knowledges aren't just a jumble of facts that scientists can go in and extract information from to put into their models to use in the way they see the world. Indigenous knowledges aren't a jumble of facts that can be possessed and used for possession. Although lots of scientists and lots of companies and lots of programs try to see them, or they do see them that way and they try to use them that way. Colonising geographies of possession that aim to extract, exploit and control, but as I said, we could think of language as one of those systems, one of those geographies. If we think about the language of management, or the language of sustainable yields in resource systems, what we hear is humans are able to manage. Humans are able to control these systems, and that the purpose of knowledge is to exercise that control. That's very different to the foundations of the Indigenous knowledges that we're working on. So we need to think about the language, how the language that we use needs to change. Just in something as simple as going from knowledge to knowledges. How can we give recognition and priority to caring for places and relationships that we rely on to survive? That's how can we begin to think or to unthink, because the next lecture is about unthinking. How can we unthink possession and control as the foundation for our action? So those are the key takeaways for students. For others, I don't know what your key takeaways might be. I'll be very interested. So that's where I'll finish and allow Etienne, are you going to give us something, you poor thing? I'm sorry. So Etienne, thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
那我想，其实，在那个课堂的一开始，我觉得，Richard 老师提出几个很重要的问题，是要我觉得老师是在引导大家在一开始跟课堂结束，跟整个课程结束可以去思考的，就是说，你觉得你知道了些什么？那你觉得你不知道什么？那你不知道是为什么你不知道？听起来很绕口令，就是为什么你会知道这些东西？是它到底是怎么建立而成的？然后。那他为什么要去引导大家思考这些的原因是，其实通常这些我们不知道的东西，其实在殖民过程里面，它被这个殖民的制度跟思想所隐藏起来，不让我们知道的事情。所以其实这是在提醒大家去注意这个部分，就是说这个殖民的制度跟思想对我们造成的影响，就是我们怎么去理解这个世界的一个影响这样。那所以再来是，他就问到说，他就提到说，其实现场。今天来很多各个学校的老师，那他也做了一个提醒，就是说，其实就要成为一个老师，其实一个要不断学习的过程。那如果我们停止了学习，其实我们今天就会停止成为一个好的老师了。所以他就带到他的另外一个问题，其实是他第一个问题啊，就他就问谁是专家这样子。那廖贤老师就是建立一个很好的例子，他其实就提醒说，其实社区的人才是专家。我们这些学者其实去社区获取知识，好像显得我们懂这些东西，其实我们并不是所谓的专家。好，然后再来好，然 后再来就是他就进到了今天的整个主题哈，就是说我们今天去谈这个联合国原住民族权利宣言哈，那个 UNDRIP 这个东西，那它这个在原住民的权利运动上，其实是一个非常重要的一个里程碑。但他就要提醒我们说，其实这个就算有了这个联合国原住民族权利宣言，其实也不是说它就可以解决了所有的问题。那他的一个提醒就是说，他虽然是从这个比较好像全球性的尺度来去谈这个原住民议题，但他在提醒我们要避免去认为越大就是越好的。我们其实很重要的事情是要把事物放在脉络情境下面去理解，因为我们这个社会、这个地球的系统其实是很多的小部分，它强调一个东西是 connection， 就是互相的连接而建立而成的哈。那所以这个脉络跟这个连结是相当重要的，而不是去思考说好像只要有一个很大的框架，一个全球性的框架，它就是一个解决各种问题的方法。那尤其在联合国的议题上面，我们其实看到的一个比较大的冲突，在原住民议题上比较大的冲突点，就是说联合国在谈的人权这件事情，其实它是属于个人的，但是原住民的权益其实是属于群体性的，它是属于集体权。然后再来另外一个问题就是说，联合国其实是由 nation state 是由国家所组成的，它不是群体所组成的。那国家存在的本身其实就是一个很有问题的事情了，就是说，就我讲很有问题的事情，它其实背后就是有这些殖民的历史才建立而成的哈。所以其实这个是在提醒我们，一直要去带着一个比较批判的观点来去看待这个东西。那这个东西不会是一个解决所有问题的答案。好，那再来，他就有提到一些就是在这个宣言里面一些比较重要的条例。那我在这边我先不赘述。不过他谈完这些条例之后，他强调的是，这个在原住民权利上面来讲，其实对于原住民是属于一个很基本的权利。但是问题是说，就算今天有联合国原住民族权利宣言去认可了这个东西，可是其实对于很多国家来说，它虽然其实在这个宣言花了30年的过程才去协商、谈判协商才完成，它其实是一个非常不容易的过程。那甚至在最后阶段还有几个国家它上面有列4个国家是不愿意签署的、不愿意同意的，虽然他们最后也同意了。但即便说这些国家它都可以接受这个原住民权利宣言，可是其实回到自己国家的时候，他自己国家还是没有办法去制定法律来去实质的去认可，就是保护原住民群体的在原住民权利宣言里面的这些权利这样。那原因就是说，因为这些国家其实这个基本上你要去谈原住民的权利，它跟国家的权利之间就是会有一些紧张关系。因为国家他会觉得，当原住民他们在声称一个自决权，或者是self determination 跟 self governance 自决跟自治的时候，其实对于这一个国家的领土的完整性就会造成了一个威胁，所以国家是很难去接受这件事情。那甚至会将很多原住民他在做自我就 self defense 在自我防卫，在面对一些议题上的自我防卫的时候，他会把这个东西视为是限制原住民自决跟自治的理由，就是他不让他们去做这个self defense 这样。然后甚至在不是只有大的事件上，包括在日常的活动，原住民的狩猎啊、捕鱼，甚至是他的一些宗教的惯习、语言文化的使用，都会让国家认为是现在是把它认知为是一个犯罪的行为。所以这让人民在国家不断的产生一些冲突，所以不是只是那些大的什么水坝啊，或者是就是比较大的这些开发议题而已，其实是即便是日常的东西，其实都让人民跟国家不断的产生冲突。好，然后再来是说他提到一个东西，就是他一直要我们去思考的是那个关系的问题，就是我们今天到底我们在讲我们是谁。他们是谁？我们跟他们彼此之间为什么会有什么样的不同？那这个关系为什么不是可以很包容性的，而是要互相有所冲突的？哈，我觉得他一直在强调的，在他的今天的演讲里面一直在强调的这个关系是要让我们去思考的。然后再来，他提到的就是说，这个殖民主义会到底为什么跟原住民之间有那么大的冲突？就是说。因为其实殖民思想其实对于土地或资源倾向的是占有，是一个占有、一个拥有的一个概念。 那可是原住民其实对于土地跟资源的想法比较是归属或者是照顾的概念，所以这个有一个很大的冲突。那他来自澳洲，所以他其实对于就是他们的他提到一个学者的一个概念叫 white possession， 就是一个白人占有的概念。他发现他在2007年第一次来台湾的时候，他就说他发现了自己的无知啊，因为他带着这个就是 white possession 其实是一个非常欧洲中心主义的一个思考方式嘛，因为毕竟是在讲白人的那个垦殖殖民主义的东西。但是他发现台湾的状况其实非常的复杂。不过他觉得，就算台湾的故事其实跟这些欧洲就是其他的可能是澳洲啊、加拿大这些就是白人占殖民的这些国家的状况不太一样，但是其实还是有很多可以去跟殖民思想做对，就是批判殖民思想做对话的地方。那他觉得这个台湾的例子可以其实为整个殖民主义的论述，就是批判殖民主义的论述带来一些不一样的观点跟思考。那这也是他不断回来这个台湾这块土地上面的原因。然后再来他就是提到说这个为什么原住民地理学是重要哈？这是他的第一章 slide 里面其实也去谈到，他自己是一个地理学家，所以他可能就是比较从一个地理学的观点来去谈说为什么地理学对于原住民的社区保育这件事情是重要的。那他觉得原住民地理学其实比较去思考的是原住民的生活、语言、过去跟未来是怎么被展现出来的。那就如同我刚说，其实原住民地理学在谈的更多是归属，而不是拥有，是属于是关于关怀，而不是去行使权利。然后那个关怀，甚至是对于人类跟非人类都进行了一个关怀，这样子。那他觉得原住民社区保护的策略其实也是这样，就是它其实比较是属于创造跟扩展这个关怀地理的这个概念，来去做保育工作这样子。好，然后再来是他最后就有提醒我们的一个东西是说，我们可以去思考这个语言这件事情，就是语言的使用这件事情。譬如说，刚刚我们一直在讲的，其实殖民思想它对于土地的想法，它比较是属于在占有跟控制，然后提取就是去截取这些资讯或者是这些资源跟开发，所以他会用一种觉得我们要保护，或者是我们要做生态系统的管理。然后或者是这种所谓的永续产量，其实一个其实比较是以就是说我们去思考，我们就觉得说我们是可以去控制这个土地跟资源的。那他就问我们让我们去想一想说，我们可以怎么样去改变这个语言的使用，然后是让我们可以就是展现出那个原住民对于土地是比较比较关怀的，或就还有刚讲那个归属的关系的展现这样子。好，那接下来的几周其实我们就会继续进行这方面的思考。